Thank you very much for joining us for another lesson from this week's Torah portion. This week we study the portion of Tzav, the second portion of the book of Leviticus. However, this Shabbat is also called Shabbat Hagadol. It's one of 4 times a year where the Shabbat has another name other than the name of the portion we study. Shabbat Hagadol translates into Shabbat the greatest. What's the reason that it's called Shabbat Hagadol? So the first Lubavitch Rebbe in Code of Law in the laws of Passover teaches us that the Torah commands us, Be'asor lachodesh arishon, God tells the Jewish people, on the 10th of the month, 5 days before exiting Egypt, you should take a lamb or a sheep and tie it to your beds and prepare it for slaughter on the 14th in the afternoon. So when they follow these requirements, the neighbors, the Egyptian neighbors, came and asked, what is this all about with the sheep? And when the Jewish people turned and said, this is the last mitzvah, good deed we perform before exiting Egypt, and God will smite all firstborn and kill all Egyptian firstborn, the Egyptian firstborn demanded from the leaders, from Pharaoh, from their families, to release the Jewish people sooner so they are not facing that plague. Their life is coming to an end. And Pharaoh and the Egyptian leaders and families refused to obey. So the Egyptian leaders, the Egyptian firstborns themselves went out and killed many Egyptians. That's why when we praise God for the exodus from Egypt, there are a famous chapter in Psalm. It's a stanza made out of 26 thankful appreciations to God. One of them reads in Hebrew, Lemakei Mitzrayim bivchoreihem, God who smite Egypt with their own firstborns. Now, when did that happen and what day of the week? The miracle of Egyptian firstborn killing Egyptians, it happened on Shabbat because the Jewish people left Egypt on Thursday. Wednesday night was Passover, and the 10th of the month fell on Shabbat. By the way, this year, Shabbat is the 10th of Nisan, and we're celebrating Passover Wednesday night, Thursday, and Friday. So it's exactly, it falls on the same weekday as it happened in the original time many years ago. And that's why I want to dedicate this talk, this Dvar Torah, for the Shabbat Hagadol. And that's why we call it Shabbat Hagadol, because the great miracle happened where the Egyptian firstborn themselves killed many Egyptians and were protesting against keeping the Jewish people slaves. The Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, is asking several questions. First is, why do we connect the miracle to the day of the week, to Shabbat, and that's why we call it Shabbat Hagadol? After all, it happened on the 10th of Nisan, and the 10th of Nisan is not always on Shabbat. Sometimes it's on the 12th of Nisan, sometimes it's on the 8th or 9th of Nisan. Number 2, what's so special that it's called the great miracle? There are many miracles that happen to Jewish people, and this is no different. Why do you name it, coin the term great miracle for this one? And the final one is, how can you call it a miracle when actually the Jews are still enslaved in Egypt? It will take them another 4.5 days or 5 days before they actually live in Egypt. So what's the big deal about getting many Egyptians to die? And the Rebbe explains the following. The Rebbe says that every miracle that God performed can be done in 2 ways. One is eradicating the cause of trouble, getting rid, killing, destroying, hurting, pushing away. But there is another type of miracle which is far greater, and that is converting the 4 into the con into a 4. Converting somebody who is negative, somebody who is trying to hurt, to becoming our friend. Making sure that the cause of our trouble turn into become the source of all our joy and happiness. This is a far greater miracle and considered a great miracle as opposed to just letting go or getting rid of the trouble that we face. And that's why Shabbat is uniquely connected to this type of miracle. Because when God created the universe, He created the week in 6 days. The days of the week, the first 6 days, had all kinds of creatures and all kinds of elements. Some of them were positive, some of them were not so. Come Shabbat, when Shabbat came, God says He rested according to the Kabbalah interpretation of rest. The rest is from all those who cause challenge, damage, and hurt. They cease from hurting and damaging and trying to challenge us. It's a day of rest from facing those challenges. In other words, Shabbat symbolizes where you take something that's not so good, an adversary, and turn into a friend instead of eradicating him. That's why the miracle of the firstborn themselves trying to fight on behalf of the Jewish people is considered a great miracle, Gadol, because you take the Egyptians themselves who are enslaving the Jewish people, and they themselves are fighting on behalf of the Jewish people. And that's why this miracle is connected to Shabbat, not the 10th of Nisan, even though sometimes the Shabbat we celebrate, Shabbat Hagadol, is not the same day when the miracle happened, because it's much closer into the Shabbat concept than just a weekday, another weekday. And that is also connected directly to the Exodus from Egypt, because this was the prelude to the Egyptians forcing the Jews out of Egypt. Says the Rebbe, that's why it's so important to celebrate the Shabbat, and we call it Shabbat Hagadol, because the Exodus from Egypt is a miniature experience of what will happen when Mashiach arrives, eradicating all our challenges, all our suffering, all our difficulties and hardship. And just like before, the difficulty, challenges, and all the adversaries, we did not get rid of them, but rather we converted them into positive and good and a blessing. So it will happen just before Mashiach arrives. All negativity will convert into positive, assisting us, supporting us, and bringing a lot more joy and happiness into our life. I would like to conclude, before I wish you Shabbat Shalom, to dedicate this Dvar Torah in honor for a quick recovery to my in-laws, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch ben Sarah, my mother-in-law, Golda Miriam bat Fega Rosa, who both are suffering from the coronavirus and they need lots of help from God. And I hope that the good deeds that everyone is doing to dedicate in their honor should help, that God will hasten their recovery to a complete recovery. May we all celebrate together and happy occasions. Thank you very much.